Have you ever heard of Absalom, King David's rebellious son? He wasn't just a traitor. His story is filled with ambition, conspiracy, and an unstoppable quest for power. But what can his betrayal teach us about justice, leadership, and the consequences of our choices? Get ready to dive into one of the most dramatic episodes in the Bible and discover how this ancient story still resonates today. Stay until the end, because you'll be surprised by the powerful lessons we can learn from this real-life epic. Silence hung over King David's palace, but beneath the surface, a storm was already brewing. The stone corridors, once witnesses to glorious celebrations and moments of worship to the God of Israel, now echoed with a heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere. How far can a man go when driven by ambition? The pursuit of power is a treacherous path, and often, the price paid is too high, not only for the one who seeks it, but for everyone around them. Absalom, King David's third son, was no mere prince living in the shadow of the throne. He was a magnetic figure, admired for his flawless beauty and overwhelming charisma. But behind the long hair and lofty demeanor, there was a restless heart, scarred by invisible wounds. His pain didn't just come from the expectations of being the son of a man after God's own heart, but from the silence of his own father in the face of injustices within their family. This is not just a story of ambition. It is a tale of betrayal that didn't arise from hatred, but from disappointment. A son longing for justice, yet finding indifference. A prince yearning for love, but receiving distance. Family bonds, meant to be fortresses, had turned into invisible chains, dragging Absalom deeper into his rage. But don't be fooled. This isn't just the story of a rebellious son. It is also the story of a father, David, torn between the king he needed to be and the man who couldn't separate the throne from his family. The fate of Israel was about to change forever, not by the sword of a distant enemy, but by the hand of an heir who, blinded by resentment, would dare to face his own blood. The stage was set. The conspiracy was in the making. And what began as a silent wound would soon explode into a war that would shake the kingdom, where father and son would confront each other, not just for the throne of Israel, but for control over their own destinies. Before chaos took hold, Israel lived in its golden age. David's reign was not only strong militarily, but spiritually as well. He had unified the tribes, conquered territories, and turned Jerusalem into the beating heart of the kingdom. The people saw him as a leader anointed by God, an invincible warrior, the one who, as a young man, had defeated Goliath and proved himself worthy of the crown. But within the palace walls, reality was more complex. The king, who inspired songs and psalms, faced his greatest battles not on the fields of war, but within his own house. Like every powerful monarch, David didn't just have one son, but several, each with their own ambitions, each heir to different mothers, and therefore to different loyalties. This boiling pot of tensions, rivalries, and family intrigues was slowly transforming into a silent threat, a crack that, over time, would compromise the foundations of his kingdom. David was a brilliant leader, but an absent father. His time was consumed by the responsibilities of the crown, military campaigns, and religious duties. Amid political alliances and war strategies, his family became fertile ground for resentment. His children grew up under the shadow of a distant father, admired by the people, but often inaccessible to those who shared his blood. And it was in this environment that Absalom was shaped. He didn't just see his father's power, he also saw his flaws. He watched up close the decisions that shaped the nation's destiny and at the same time felt the weight of neglect within the home. At the center of this turmoil lay an inevitable truth. Even the man after God's own heart wasn't immune to the consequences of his mistakes. David's kingdom shone for the world, but inside the palace, the shadows stretched long. And where there are shadows, there are those who prepare to walk through them. In the luxurious chambers of the palace, surrounded by fine rugs and golden columns, grew a young man who seemed born for greatness. Absalom was the son of King David and Maacah, the princess of Geshur, a small kingdom north of Israel. His lineage mixed Israelite and foreign blood, giving him a unique origin that, in some ways, set him apart from his brothers. From a young age, he carried an invisible weight. To be the son of a man chosen by God, meaning his life would always be measured against that of his father. Raised among princes and nobles, Absalom had everything a young man could desire. Fine linen garments, jewels, servants always at his disposal, banquets with the best foods of the kingdom. But luxury did not erase his restlessness. Unlike many of his brothers, he wasn't just a king's son. He was an heir who felt he was destined for something greater. He grew up hearing stories of David's heroic deeds, of the young shepherd who had slain a giant with a stone. He heard of the king who had conquered Jerusalem and turned Israel into a powerhouse. How could he compete with such a legendary father? How could he step out of his shadow and prove he too was worthy of the crown? But it wasn't just the expectation of greatness that shaped Absalom. His character was forged by the environment around him, and the palace, for all its splendor, was also a place of tension. David had many wives and many sons, and each of them had their own ambitions. The struggles for influence, political games, and small daily betrayals shaped life at court. Those who weren't clever enough to understand these dynamics would soon become expendable pieces on the power board. Absalom learned to observe. He learned to speak the right words to the right people. But above all, he learned that power isn't given, it's taken. And within him, he carried a bitter lesson that would follow him for the rest of his life. In the royal palace, blood ties didn't always mean loyalty. Absalom wasn't just a prince. He was the very definition of perfection in the eyes of the people. The Bible describes him as the most beautiful man in Israel, a young man without a single flaw from head to toe. His presence radiated a magnetic aura, making everyone turn to him when he entered a room. But it wasn't just his appearance that made him fascinating. It was the way he moved, spoke, and looked at people. He knew the impact he had and used it to his advantage. His long, thick hair became a symbol of his identity. He let it grow, and when he cut it, the impressive weight of his locks was commented on by everyone. To many, his vast mane was a reflection of his strength and vitality, a sign that he was someone special, destined for great deeds. And indeed, Absalom knew how to turn his image into power. He walked among the people, smiled, greeted, listened to stories, and showed closeness to those who longed for royal attention. While David, with the weight of government on his shoulders, became a distant leader, Absalom cultivated an opposite reputation. That of an accessible prince, a man who understood the suffering of the humble and shared their dreams. But behind this charming charisma, there was something deeper. The vanity that shone in his eyes was merely a reflection of his growing ambition. He didn't just want to be admired, he wanted to be followed. Every fascinated gaze, every whispered compliment, every act of adoration he received reinforced his belief that the throne should be his. Pride was a seed that grew inside him, nurtured by the adoration of the crowds and the certainty that his destiny was not just to be a prince, but a king. In the heart of the royal palace, among the stone corridors that held deep secrets, lived Tamar, Absalom's sister. She was beautiful, with a sweetness in her gaze that enchanted all who knew her. Raised under the protection of the king, she seemed untouchable, a precious jewel in the house of David. However, her innocence was cruelly torn away in an act of betrayal that would forever mark the royal family's history. Amnon, Tamar's half-brother and David's firstborn, burned with desire for her. The feeling he harbored was not love, but a sick obsession. Unable to control his longing, he devised a wicked plan. He pretended to be ill and asked for Tamar to be brought to his room to prepare a meal for him. Moved by kindness and trusting her brother, she obeyed, unaware of what was about to happen. Once alone with her, Amnon revealed his true intention. Tamar tried to resist, pleading with him not to commit such a wicked act, but it was in vain. He forced her, destroying not only her honor but her soul. And as if that wasn't enough, after the vile act, Amnon's desire turned into contempt. He cast her out of his room, leaving her alone, humiliated and irreparably wounded. The palace, which should have been her refuge, became her prison of pain. Dishonored, Tamar covered herself in ashes, tore her clothes, and wept uncontrollably. However, the greatest injustice was not just the crime, but the silence that followed. When David heard what had happened, he was outraged, but he did not punish Amnon. The king, who had so often shown courage in battle, now hesitated when it came to the need for justice within his own house. Absalom, seeing his sister's pain, said nothing. But behind his silent eyes, a fire burned. He took Tamar into his home, cared for her, but within himself, he made a vow. This affront would not go unpunished. If his father would not seek justice, he would take on that responsibility himself. The anger growing in his chest was not only against Amnon, but also against David's weakness. Time would pass, but Absalom would not forget. And when the time came, he would demand payment for every tear his sister shed. The royal court went on with its routine, and to the untrained eye, everything seemed normal. But within Absalom's heart, an uncontrollable fire burned. He did not shout, confront, or let slip a single word about what he felt. His silence was not forgetfulness, but rather an abyss where revenge grew, slow and relentless. Since the day of the tragedy, Tamar had closed herself off in silent mourning, living in her brother's house as a shadow of what she once was. Her once bright eyes now carried a deep emptiness, and her presence, which had once filled the palace halls with grace and sweetness, had become a constant reminder of Amnon's impunity. Absalom saw this day after day. He saw his sister wilt like a flower abandoned in the desert. He saw Amnon walking through the palace halls, surrounded by friends and servants, living without guilt, as though nothing had happened. But what hurt most was seeing his father, the king, the man who had the duty to ensure justice, remain inert. David's silence was not ignorance, it was cowardice. Absalom knew his father loved Tamar. He knew it tormented him. But he also knew that Amnon was the firstborn, the natural heir to the throne. David, just as he was in his songs and psalms, had failed when it mattered most. And so, Absalom decided that he would be the hand of justice himself. He couldn't act impulsively. A sudden attack could cost him his own life. If he truly wanted revenge, he would have to wait, cultivate the illusion of forgiveness, become unpredictable. For 2 long years, he became a master of deceit. Every look at Amnon was measured, every word calculated, every gesture rehearsed. Absalom knew that time erased suspicion, and his patience was his greatest weapon. But hatred never left him. It grew silently, strengthening with each sleepless night, with every time he saw Tamar hide from the eyes of the world. His heart was a volcano about to erupt. And so, while the palace saw only a serene and resigned prince, within Absalom, the shadow of revenge was already preparing its strike. Absalom's plan was about to come to fruition. For 2 years, he had set the stage patiently, without raising suspicion. The revenge he had envisioned in his mind was now about to become reality, and he knew the moment to act could no longer be delayed. Absalom invited Amnon to a feast he had organized, an apparently innocent celebration where family and friends would be treated to a grand meal. But behind the simplicity of the event, something more was at stake. The banquet was not just a party. It was the stage where Absalom prepared to seal his brother's fate. Amnon, who never suspected what was about to happen, accepted the invitation without hesitation. He still saw Absalom as a brother, someone he could trust, someone with whom he could share light-hearted moments. But Absalom, with his cautious smile and calm demeanor, had become a master of deception. As the feast unfolded, the rebellious prince watched Amnon's every move with sharp eyes, waiting for the right moment to act. He had instructed his servants to be ready, but kept his own presence discreet, almost invisible. The atmosphere was tense, though no one knew it. The merriment disguised the storm that was about to hit. When the moment arrived, Absalom gave a silent signal, and the servants, who were aware of the plan, carried out the order without hesitation. Amnon, drunk on food and wine, had no time to react when Absalom's men attacked him brutally. The death was swift and decisive, the execution of a vengeance that had been 2 years in the making. The shock was immediate. The palace, once filled with joy, transformed into a sea of screams and confusion. The news of the murder spread quickly, and the faces of all those present at the feast turned pale. Amnon, David's firstborn, the son who had been protected by his position, had fallen. The court was silent, stunned, unsure of how to react. But Absalom knew nothing more could be done. The act was done. His relationship with David was shattered forever, but Absalom's revenge was complete. However, the impact of his action would reverberate for much longer. Amnon's murder not only destroyed one man's life, it ripped apart the last remnants of harmony in David's house. From that moment on, the shadows of betrayal and rebellion began to settle permanently in the kingdom of Israel. Amnon's murder did not go unnoticed, and the consequences began to spread like wildfire. When the news reached David's ears, the shock was profound. The pain of losing a son was not the only emotion that overwhelmed him, but the realization that his family's legacy was being corroded from within. But what would David do? How could he deal with a son who had defied his authority and tarnished the reputation of the royal house? David's response was a mix of anger and sorrow. Israel's royalty was now divided, and David's decision was clear. Absalom must be exiled, removed from Jerusalem to prevent an escalation of violence and to maintain what little stability remained in the kingdom. With a heavy heart, David allowed Absalom to flee to Geshur, his grandfather Talmai's land, where he would stay for 3 years. Geshur, a distant kingdom far from the center of Israel's power, now became Absalom's refuge. It was both a physical and emotional exile. He was far from the Jerusalem court, from his father, from his friends, and from everything that connected him to his identity as a prince. However, away from the kingdom and the watchful eyes, Absalom found himself in a paradoxical situation. While his name and actions divided people, he also took this time to rise again, to make new plans. Geshur was not a place where the prince could hide forever. On the contrary, in that exile, Absalom's ambitious spirit was inflamed. Each day away from the throne fueled his desire for power and revenge. And contrary to what many thought, he was not lost in the limbo of exile. Absalom began to strengthen his image as a leader, to cultivate alliances with local rulers, and most importantly, to build a loyal army, without his father ever knowing. Over time, loneliness and regret gave way to an even more elaborate plan. Absalom refused to be seen as a fugitive. He knew that, to claim the throne, he would need more than just local alliances. He needed followers, he needed an army, he needed the people of Israel to support him. This exile, therefore, was not a period of defeat, but rather a strategic opportunity, a chance to mature in his ambitions and lay the groundwork for a future triumphant return. Deep down, Absalom knew that being far from Jerusalem didn't mean the end of his struggle for the throne. On the contrary, it was the first step in an even more turbulent journey. Time passed, and Absalom, far from the eyes of his father and the people, found himself shaping his own narrative. The exile, which many considered a period of weakness, turned out to be a stage of preparation. He wasn't content being a prince relegated to distant lands. Each day, his desire for return and revenge grew. He knew that his rise to the throne of Israel would require more than mere ambition. He needed David's permission, but more than that, he needed to manipulate the situation to make his return inevitable. It was then that, after 3 long years, Commander Joab stepped onto the scene. Joab, ever pragmatic and observant, knew that David's reign was at a delicate point, and Absalom's presence, though problematic, could become useful. With his experience in palace intrigues, Joab devised a bold plan to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem. In a strategic move, Joab convinced David to allow the prodigal son's return, arguing that the king should give his son another chance, believing it would be a sign of greatness and forgiveness. However, when Absalom finally returned to Jerusalem, the meeting with his father was avoided. David allowed his return, but didn't welcome him with open arms. The rebellious prince was relegated to live in his own house, far from the court and the royal presence. The emotional abandonment was more painful for Absalom than any physical punishment. He was back, yes, but what he longed for most, what his heart burned for, was the recognition of his father, a triumphant return beside David, not a silent humiliation in his own house. This rejection only intensified Absalom's resentment. He felt scorned, ignored, as if he were treated like a stranger in his own land. Each day that passed without David calling him to the palace added weight to the humiliation. But instead of succumbing to sadness, Absalom used this time to restructure his strategy. He wasn't there to submit, he was there to conquer. During this period of separation, he began to carefully shape his image. Absalom knew he needed to win over the people of Israel to secure his ascent. He became more accessible, more visible. He walked the streets, stopped at the city gates where people gathered, and listened to their complaints and frustrations. He presented himself as an understanding prince, willing to solve the people's problems. Unlike his father, who was always busy with state affairs and distant from the people, Absalom appeared present, interested in the small daily matters, thereby earning the trust of the citizens. Absalom's return to Jerusalem, far from being a simple family reunion, marked the beginning of a new phase in his journey to the throne. Every gesture, every word, every action of Absalom was carefully calculated to undermine David's authority and put his own name on the lips of the people. He knew that to conquer the kingdom, he would need more than military force. He needed the adulation of the people, the trust of those who could help him overthrow his father. Absalom, with his return to Jerusalem, was not content to live in the shadow of his father, the great King David. He knew that the path to the throne would not be given to him by inheritance or the king's kindness. Instead, he would need to win the people's hearts, drawing them away from the distant and sometimes rigid figure of David. To do this, he devised a clever political plan, a plan that would be key in overthrowing his own father while simultaneously conquering the kingdom of Israel. At the city gates, where the Israelites gathered to discuss disputes and seek justice, Absalom made his presence known. He positioned himself strategically, not only to listen, but to become the solution to all problems. People came to him with their complaints, often facing the coldness of a distant king too busy to engage in everyday matters. Absalom, on the other hand, was attentive and friendly. His response was always the same. "If I were a judge in this kingdom, I would deliver justice immediately." Absalom's promises were as sweet as honey to the ears of the people. He made himself accessible, engaging, someone who truly cared about the difficulties of his subjects. Meanwhile, David, the revered king, was occupied with the kingdom and his own personal challenges. Absalom contrasted sharply with this image. He presented himself as the leader who would give the people a voice and bring swift solutions to everyday problems. His ability to listen and his promise of immediate justice began to generate sympathy, and many began to see in him the true alternative to David's rule. It didn't take long for the first signs of popular support to appear. Absalom used his oratory skills to convince the masses that he was the leader needed to transform Israel. His message was clear: a new beginning, an era of justice and equality, where the people would finally have a ruler who genuinely cared about their issues. He was becoming not just a prince, but a symbol of change and renewal. The former rebellious prince was no longer just concerned with the internal affairs of the palace. Now he began to plant the seeds of a silent revolution. He knew that, to conquer the throne, he needed the trust of the majority, those common people who felt abandoned by David. And with each encounter at the city gates, Absalom gained more and more allies. Absalom's political intelligence was not limited to the popularity he was gaining. He also knew he needed military support. Using his network of allies, he began to form a solid military base, promising rewards and status to those who followed him. Absalom's promises became irresistible, creating a political and military foundation that grew stronger every day. Everything Absalom was doing was carefully calculated. He wasn't just winning hearts and minds. He was building the foundation for something much bigger, the path to the throne. When the people began to call for him as the true leader, Absalom felt that the moment to act was drawing near. As Absalom's popularity grew, he began to realize the power of words and perceptions. It wasn't just the common people he needed to win over, but also those who influenced the masses and held the structure of power in place. Absalom was shrewd. He knew that to overthrow David, he needed not just military strength but also public approval, so that his army's actions would be seen as legitimate and just. He began to plant seeds of dissatisfaction, sowing doubts about his father's leadership and questioning David's choices before the people. The first rumors were subtle, almost imperceptible. David is aging. He no longer has the energy to lead. Absalom positioned himself as the solution to the kingdom's problems, the prince who could restore Israel to greatness. It wasn't enough to just present himself as the neglected and wronged son. He knew he needed to paint David as incapable, as someone no longer in tune with the needs of the people. He began to insinuate that David was no longer attentive to the people's problems and that his leadership was marked by failures and omissions. Absalom presented himself as the future of Israel, the leader who would bring prosperity and justice. This narrative began to spread like wildfire. The power of Absalom's words, combined with the growing sympathy of the people, turned opposition to David into a matter of justice and the need for change. In his cunning, Absalom did not limit himself to making promises alone. He knew that in order to effectively manipulate public opinion, he needed to demonstrate his ability to act. Absalom surrounded himself with advisors and allies who helped shape this image of the ideal ruler. Comparisons with David were inevitable. While the old king appeared distant, often occupied with military and religious matters, Absalom presented himself as someone attentive, accessible, a leader willing to listen and act swiftly. Every word he spoke seemed truer and more convincing than David's latest decision. Over the months, he carefully built a network of allies, politicians, and army officers who, over time, became his loyal followers. What began as a simple seed of distrust was skillfully cultivated, until many started to believe that David was a weakened leader, incapable of handling the complexities of the kingdom. Absalom not only manipulated David's public image, he also began to construct a narrative of betrayal and abandonment. The fact that his father, the great David, had not called him back to the palace, had not accepted him as a true prince, was transformed into a symbol of David's coldness and lack of leadership. This fed the idea that he, Absalom, was the true leader of Israel, the prince of a new era. Every move, every speech, every act was a piece of a larger game, where the people's perception became as important as the strength of his army. Absalom had learned how to use his weaknesses to his advantage, and now he was about to reap the rewards of his meticulous manipulation of public opinion. His rise was just beginning, and slowly, he was becoming not just David's challenger, but also the future that many were beginning to expect. When Absalom began to realize that the people's support was growing, he knew he couldn't wait much longer. The next move was the riskiest and boldest of all, an open conspiracy against David, his own father. It was a decisive shift, where manipulating public opinion would turn into direct action, and the battle for the throne would no longer be a matter of words, but a military confrontation. It was at this crucial moment that Absalom sought strategic alliances. He was not alone in this endeavor. The first, and perhaps most significant of these alliances, was with Ahithophel, one of David's closest and most respected advisors. Ahithophel, who until then had been a pillar of David's reign, saw in Absalom an opportunity to take revenge on a king who might no longer have the same power and respect. By gaining Ahithophel's support, Absalom not only gained an influential ally, but also acquired high-level strategic intelligence, essential for carrying out his plan. With Ahithophel's help, Absalom began to carefully plan the next steps. He knew that to challenge David effectively, he would need a strong and disciplined army. The first part of the plan was to gather an army of loyal followers. With the support of his allies and new recruits, Absalom formed a substantial force, composed of men eager for change and the promise of a new government. Meanwhile, tensions inside the palace continued to grow. David was constantly confronted with news that his son was gaining strength, but he, confident in his own authority and the foundations of his reign, was not fully prepared to face such a great betrayal. Absalom, on the other hand, knew he needed to act before the king could prepare to retaliate. He began to send increasingly clear signals that he was ready for war. He didn't just want the people's recognition. He wanted power, and he was willing to challenge his own father to claim it. While Absalom was in Hebron, he took the definitive step. He declared himself king of Israel, a move that not only challenged David, but also claimed for himself the legitimacy of the reign, as if the throne were his by right. Hebron, with its historical significance as a place of coronation, became the symbolic setting for the start of the open rebellion. This act of self-proclamation was not just a strategic move. It was a message to the people of Israel that Absalom was no longer just a prince seeking his place, but the true leader of the kingdom, capable of bringing a new era of prosperity and justice. With Absalom's appointment as king, civil war became inevitable. David, upon learning of his son's betrayal, found himself in a desperate situation. The conspiracy was already underway, and his own son was leading a rebellion with the support of powerful allies. Israel's peace was shattered, and the division between father and son had now become a matter of survival for both. Absalom did not hesitate. He knew that to achieve his goal, it wasn't enough to be the people's favorite. He needed a military force capable of destroying his father's reign, and with Ahithophel's support, he was now ready to take the war to David, not only as a confrontation of armies, but as a battle for the future of Israel. Absalom's journey had taken an irreversible step. He was no longer just the son of King David. He had proclaimed himself king of Israel, and now his name was tied to a future of drastic changes. By choosing to proclaim himself, Absalom not only challenged his father's authority, but also created an irreparable division within the kingdom. Hebron, a city of great symbolism for the kings of Israel, became the stage for his rise. It was not just a formal coronation, but an act of rupture with the past and a promise of a new government. The decision to declare himself king in Hebron had symbolic importance. There, David had been anointed king for the first time, and now his own son was taking the same path, but in a defiant and audacious manner. The city that once witnessed David's rise would now be the birthplace of Absalom's rebellion. The movement was meticulously planned, and its execution flawless. Absalom knew he needed the support of the population to legitimize his claim, and for that, he used every possible trick. At the moment Absalom proclaimed himself king, the popular support seemed undeniable. The promises of justice and prosperity, the criticisms of David's leadership, the construction of his image as an accessible and modern leader, all of this made many Israelites see in Absalom a new hope. His fiery speeches, his charismatic presence, and his talent for enchanting the masses won over those who were dissatisfied with his father's reign. For many, David's figure was already associated with old age and weariness, and Absalom represented energy and change. Absalom was not just the leader of a rebellion. He presented himself as the legitimate leader of Israel. His self-proclamation not only shifted the balance of power within the kingdom, but also divided the hearts of the people, who now faced a choice between the old king and the new prince. The strength of his movement came not only from military support or strategic alliances, but from how he managed to penetrate the minds and hearts of the Israelites. He was not just a rebellious son. He was the hero of an imminent revolution. In the following days, Absalom's movement continued to gain strength. Allies and followers joined him, eager for the promise of a brighter future under his leadership. But what Absalom didn't know was that his self-proclamation was also setting in motion an inevitable tragedy. His rise to power would not just be a political struggle, but a family battle that would lead to destruction and pain. Deep down, Absalom believed his destiny was to be king of Israel, but what he didn't imagine was that the price for this ambition would be higher than he could bear. Meanwhile, David, though devastated by his son's betrayal, knew that war was now inevitable. The path to confrontation was being laid, and the former king of Israel was preparing for one of the greatest challenges of his life: to reclaim the throne and restore peace to his kingdom, or perhaps lose everything, including his relationship with his own son. The air was thick with the tension that enveloped the royal palace. The announcement of Absalom's self-proclamation as king reverberated through the halls, reaching the ears of everyone in Jerusalem. In the heart of old King David, the pain was immeasurable. The weight of the betrayal by his own son, whom he had raised with so much love and hope, cut deeper than any sword. But the greatest pain of all wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that he had failed as a father and as a leader. The kingdom he had built, with so much sacrifice and dedication, was now on the brink of ruin. The city he loved, Jerusalem, would now become the stage for a devastating civil war. With the wind against him, David knew his reign was in danger. However, the decision was swift and decisive. He would not allow Jerusalem to be torn apart by war, especially not because of his own son. The pain of seeing Absalom rise against him was intensified by the need to preserve the lives of his subjects and avoid the bloodshed that a battle within the city would bring. In the dead of night, David gathered his most loyal officers and prepared to leave. The escape was not an act of cowardice, but an attempt to avoid the worst. The king knew that his army, though strong, could not guarantee victory in a battle within the walls of Jerusalem. The decision was made with the urgency of someone who knew that by leaving the city, he was not only abandoning his position of power, but also his own dignity. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: his fate was in God's hands. David's heart was broken, but his mind was resolute. As he looked at the high walls of Jerusalem for the last time, he felt a mixture of sorrow and resignation. He prayed, not for victory, but for protection. David asked God to frustrate Absalom's plans and to give him strength to face what was to come. He knew that deep down, his struggle was not just against his son, but against the fate he himself had helped shape. As David and his entourage left the gates of Jerusalem behind, the king felt the weight of his decision. It was a moment of public humiliation, but also of humility. He, who had once been the great leader of Israel, was now fleeing from his own city. But in his mind, the future was not yet lost. The exile would be temporary. The battle for his life and his kingdom was just beginning. As the night wore on and the sound of David and his men's footsteps echoed through the deserted streets of Jerusalem, the city seemed to breathe in silence. Absalom, in his thirst for power, did not yet realize how much this flight represented an act of survival and wisdom. For David, the fight for the throne was not over. It had only changed its stage. The battlefield was already being set, but the war was not just physical. For David, now exiled and far from Jerusalem, the coming battle was a struggle for the survival of his legacy, his family, and the nation he so deeply loved. As his son Absalom rose as a charismatic and ambitious leader, David, with his experience, knew that the real war would not only be fought with swords and shields, but with wisdom, strategy, and courage. David quickly and precisely gathered his army, but his strength was smaller in number compared to the large crowd of followers that Absalom had gained. The disadvantage in terms of soldiers was clear, but David's experience, forged through years of wars, battles, and victories, was what gave him confidence. He knew it wasn't just about defeating his son, but preserving the honor, justice, and future of Israel. The king was aware that his command would be challenged by a larger army, but he also believed that his experience and knowledge of the terrain could turn the tide in his favor. As preparations continued, David's confidence in his leadership was unwavering. He knew that his army, though smaller, possessed a cohesion and loyalty that Absalom could not buy. His men had followed David through years of glory and adversity. They knew what he represented, and that made the fight more than just a matter of power. It was a defense of the integrity of Israel, its culture, and its God. David's strategies began to take shape. He knew he needed to use the terrain to his advantage. Absalom's army, no matter how large, did not have the same experience as his own. David trusted that, in an unknown or complex terrain, the more experienced men could turn the tide of the battle. He wasn't just planning defense. He was also thinking about how to attack with precision, exploiting any weakness in the rebel army. His experience with warriors who knew the battlefield well would be a vital trump card. But as preparations for battle continued, David also knew that something more was at stake. It wasn't just a war for the throne. It was an emotional, internal battle where a father's love for his son was being challenged by the need to preserve order and peace for his people. The dilemma David faced was profound. He knew that by fighting against Absalom, he might be fighting against his own blood, against the future of his legacy. But at the same time, he could not allow the chaos and division Absalom brought to destroy everything he had built. The leader of Israel was aware of the tragedy unfolding before him. He was preparing his army, but the spirit of the fight was marked by a painful melancholy. David knew the path to war with Absalom was inevitable, but in his heart, he wished for something different. He didn't want to see his son on the battlefield. He didn't want to see blood between them. Yet, the need to restore peace in Israel and the continuity of his reign pushed him toward this cruel decision. The king knew that, in a world where power is seized by force, the consequences of a civil war would be unpredictable. As David's men took their positions and the final strategies were drawn, the king looked to the horizon, aware that tomorrow would bring more than a military battle. It would also be a fight for the soul of his kingdom and for his own redemption. The tension hung in the air like a thick cloud about to burst. The terrain where the battle would be fought was far from the scenario Absalom had planned. He, with his confidence in his superior numbers, believed he could crush David's forces easily. However, the natural forces, combined with a meticulous strategy, soon showed that Absalom's plans were about to be undone. The forest of Ephraim, with its dense trees and uneven terrain, became the stage for one of the most decisive battles in the history of Israel. Absalom's army, with its troops formed in a disordered and often uncoordinated manner, was confronted by the cunning and experience of David's men. The fight was not just against the enemy army, but also against the difficulties posed by nature itself. The tall trees and rough terrain made movement difficult for Absalom's troops, who, despite their larger numbers, lacked the experience of their opponents. David, on the other hand, used the forest to his advantage. He knew that the military experience of his men would be crucial in such an environment. Each man was familiar with the terrain, knowing how to move and where to position the troops for maximum impact. Furthermore, David's leadership in times of adversity was an unparalleled advantage. His soldiers, who had fought by his side in countless battles, were ready to trust his guidance and lead them to victory. The conflict began tumultuously, with dense vegetation making visibility and communication difficult. Shouts and clangs of swords mixed with the sounds of the struggle, but despite being outnumbered, David's forces began to gain ground. While Absalom's men were overwhelmed by the pressure of the terrain and disorganization, David managed to maintain a solid and cohesive defensive line. Amidst the chaos of the battle, Absalom, desperate to gain an advantage, attempted to flank David's forces. But as if fate itself were at play, something happened that would unexpectedly change the course of the battle. As Absalom tried to escape into the forest, a terrible thing occurred. His hair, which had always been a symbol of his vanity and pride, got caught in the branches of a tree. He, with his imposing figure and self-confidence, was left completely vulnerable, suspended in the air, unable to move. His horse, sensing the danger, bolted, leaving the Prince of Israel hanging, defenseless. It was in this moment of vulnerability that the irony of fate revealed itself in its cruelest form. Absalom, who had long believed that his beauty and power would make him invincible, was now at the mercy of his enemies. It was a strange sight to see the rebellious leader trapped by the very traits that had made him famous. David's army, upon witnessing this scene, felt a mix of surprise and satisfaction. But the battle was not yet won. The sound of the battle echoed in the distance, but within the Ephraim forest, everything seemed to stop for a moment. Absalom, his head trapped in the branches of a tree, experienced a sense of helplessness he had never imagined. The man who had challenged his father, who had schemed for so long to usurp the throne, was now at the mercy of a simple shrub, his long hair, symbol of his vanity, making him an easy target. While his soldiers continued to fight deep in the forest, with the chaos and noise of battle muffled by the thick vegetation, Absalom remained there, suspended, his thoughts turning to what he had lost. The arrogance that had led him this far now left him vulnerable, his hopes of power and triumph crumbling with each passing second. David, somewhere far away, still commanded his troops with his usual skill. But in his heart, the pain of fighting against his own son, of seeing his son's dreams fall, was something that silently consumed him. He knew victory was within reach, but his heart was heavy with what was about to unfold. In the forest, David's soldiers found Absalom trapped, still not fully understanding what they were seeing. They hesitated, undecided. Some wanted to kill him right there. After all, he was the key to ending the rebellion. Others, however, could not ignore the weight of David's order: spare his son's life. But upon seeing the prince hanging there, so fragile and vulnerable, a leader emerged among David's men, Joab. Joab, who had always been ruthless in his military decisions, knew time was running out. He wasn't driven by sentimentality, and David's orders were clear, but the weight of the situation was evident. He did not hesitate. With a cold, calculated look, Joab decided that Absalom's death was the only way to secure victory and restore stability to the kingdom of Israel. With fierce determination, Joab gave the order for the young prince to be captured and killed. His men, without hesitation, obeyed, and Absalom's end was inevitable. Absalom's fall was tragic not only because of the premature death of a man with so much potential, but also because he had been consumed by his own ambition. His desire for power, his rebellion against David, and his own flaws were his undoing. What had started as a struggle for a throne turned into a dark end, devoid of honor and glory. This death was not just a military blow against the rebellion, but a bitter lesson for all involved. Vanity, pride, and unchecked ambition can turn a prince into a prisoner of his own choices. The news of Absalom's death spread quickly across the battlefield. David's victory was unquestionable, but a shadow of sadness hung over the victor. The king had achieved the resounding defeat of his rebellious son, but victory brought no relief to his heart. Deep inside, David knew that war could never bring the peace he so desperately sought, especially when it came to his own flesh and blood. When Joab, with a grim expression, approached David and delivered the news, the king, already devastated by the consequences of the rebellion, could hardly believe it. The pain overwhelmed him like a crashing wave. He fell to his knees, as if the weight of the world had fallen upon him. "O Absalom, my son, would that I had died instead of you." These words, filled with anguish and regret, echoed in the silence of the palace room. David's eyes filled with tears, and the pain of losing his son, regardless of the rebellion he had caused, seemed deeper than any military defeat. He remembered the days when Absalom was just a child, with his charming smile, bright eyes, and a promising journey ahead of him. He wondered where he had failed, what he could have done differently to prevent this tragic end. Absalom was no longer the impetuous warrior prince who had challenged his father. He was now a tragic figure, a reflection of human choices and flaws. Absalom's death, as inevitable as it was, brought no peace. Instead, it deepened David's pain, making the open wound between them all the more apparent. He could not erase the memory of his son, nor justify the rebellion that had led to his death. Joab, aware of the king's pain, tried to comfort him, but the loss of Absalom was irreparable. The war, with its victories and defeats, now seemed distant to David. What he felt was a deep emptiness, a father's lament that could never be replaced by victories or any other achievement. He had lost a son, and that loss, no matter how the kingdom had been saved, was more devastating than any battle he had fought. The tragedy of Absalom was not just a military event. It revealed the fragility of human relationships, the pain of a father in the face of his own son's failure, and the futility of revenge and pride. For David, the cost of this war was more than he could ever pay. David was there, alone in his chamber, the echoes of the battle still vibrating in his mind. The sound of victory had never felt so distant. Around him, the palace seemed to have lost its grandeur. and the walls that had once witnessed his triumphs now became a silent prison of lament. He had won the war, but he had lost his soul in the process. "O Absalom, my son, would that I had died instead of you." These words, repeated in his mind like a mantra of pain, expressed an irreparable loss. It was not the loss of a mere prince, but the loss of what he loved most, his own flesh and blood, someone who in his vision should have been the future of the kingdom, but who instead had become the most feared and hated enemy. David, sitting with his head in his hands, was immersed in his tears, unable to control the wave of sadness that flooded over him. The loss of Absalom was not a matter of politics or the kingdom. It was a matter of fatherhood. The pain of losing a child, no matter what he had done, was an endless abyss. David wondered if he could have done more, if his absence in family matters had contributed to Absalom's rebellion. He tried to understand where he went wrong, but each thought seemed to sink him deeper into sorrow. His lament was not just for Absalom, but also for his own failure to prevent his son from being consumed by ambition and vengeance. He blamed himself for not being the father Absalom needed, for not providing the attention and guidance his son required. He wished he could turn back time, correct the mistakes, give advice, prevent his son from falling into the web of betrayal and anger. But nothing could change what had happened. The war had not only destroyed family bonds, but also David's hope for a future where he and Absalom could, in some way, reconcile. Now he found himself alone, with only the memory of a lost son, who had been both a reflection of his own failures and a relentless enemy. David's grief was so immense that the advisors surrounding him, aware of the gravity of the moment, hesitated to approach. But the sight of a broken and powerless king was a clear signal that something beyond a battle had been lost. The entire country felt the king's sorrow, and the population, which had once feared Absalom's growing power, now found itself reflected in the pain of his father. David's lament echoed like a cry that transcended time. He knew the kingdom could not be ruled by such a devastated man, but he also understood that the healing of his pain would not come easily. In his heart, he would forever carry the mark of Absalom's death, a mark that could never be erased. The story of David and Absalom was not just one of battles and victories, but one of love, sorrow, and deep loss. Absalom's death was not only a devastating blow to David on a personal level, but also a deep wound to the political and social structures of Israel. The kingdom David had fought so hard to build was now scarred by division. The throne, which he had always occupied with wisdom and a longing for justice, was shaken by civil war. The lines of loyalty, once firm, were now torn apart, and the impact of this war would be felt for a long time. With Absalom's death, many of the prince's followers found themselves leaderless. Absalom's army, which had once prided itself on its strength and ambition, was scattered and now found itself in limbo, unsure of its fate. Some of Absalom's former allies, those who had joined the movement in hopes of change, were now confused. The prince's betrayal of his own father created a vacuum of trust, and many began to question the loyalty of the leaders who had supported the rebellion. David, though victorious, was unable to immediately restore unity among the tribes of Israel. The mourning for Absalom's death was not an isolated concern. It had a direct reflection on the internal relations of the kingdom. Those who had stood against Absalom during the rebellion now faced a difficult question. How could they support a king who had lost so much, who was no longer the same man who had won so many battles? David's suffering was evident, and many feared that the king's emotional weakness could pose a risk to the kingdom's stability. Moreover, political tensions between the tribes of Israel intensified. Some tribes that had supported David during the revolt began to wonder if he would still be able to govern justly and effectively. Issues of leadership and succession came to the forefront. The death of Absalom, far from bringing peace, stirred up new disputes over who should occupy the throne and how internal rivalries could be resolved. To many, Israel's throne seemed more vulnerable than ever. The social consequences were also profound. Families that had lost their sons in battle, civilians who had witnessed the war up close, and communities divided between the loyalists to David and those who had supported Absalom, all faced a future of uncertainty. The effects of civil war left scars, not only on the battlefield, but on the spirit of the nation. Distrust and bitterness spread, and what should have been a united kingdom became a land divided, where the scars of war could never be fully erased. The weight of the decisions made by Absalom and the consequences of his rebellion were felt throughout the nation of Israel. The death of the rebellious prince did not seal peace. On the contrary, the civil war had only begun to leave its trail of destruction. The future of Israel's kingdom was now in David's hands, but he knew that recovery would require much more than military strength. It would require restoring lost trust, healing emotional and political wounds, and rebuilding a torn nation. After Absalom's death, David found himself facing a new reality. His rebellious son had been defeated, but the throne of Israel was still far from secure. The internal struggles that had marked the civil war would not disappear with Absalom's death. Now, more than ever, David had to deal with power disputes within his own family. Though he had ruled with wisdom for many years, the king knew that the balance between his heirs and the power of the monarchy was about to be tested. With the death of the rebellious prince, the figure of Solomon, David's son with Bathsheba, emerged as a possible successor. However, the choice of a successor would not be easy. Solomon, though young and promising, was not the only legitimate heir. David had other sons, and each of them could claim his place on the throne, causing growing tensions between them. The dispute over succession would be inevitable, with different factions trying to secure the support of those with the greatest political and military influence. Solomon, however, had a unique advantage: the wisdom that, according to the Bible, David saw in him. The king understood that choosing Solomon as his successor could be the key to maintaining the kingdom's stability. But this decision would not come without challenges. Solomon's own mother, Bathsheba, knew the path would be long and difficult. She would use her influence over the king to ensure that her son had the chance to ascend to the throne, knowing that the intrigues and rivalries among David's sons could destroy any hope for peace in the kingdom. The battle for succession was not limited to family disputes. It extended to David's political allies, generals, and nobles who had supported the king throughout his career. Some of Israel's most powerful men, such as Joab, the army commander, and Abiathar, the priest, were deeply involved in the decisions about who should rule. The pressure to maintain unity among the various groups of Israeli society, divided by their own interests, was immense. As David tried to shape the future of his kingdom, he knew that the stability of the throne would be tested by those seeking power, like Adonijah, another of his sons, who also saw himself as a strong candidate for the throne. The tension between the brothers grew, with each seeking the support of different factions within the nobility and the army. To ensure that Solomon was recognized as the legitimate successor, David needed to act quickly and with cunning. The disputes over who should inherit the throne could result in a new civil war, and the king knew that the kingdom could not withstand another internal division. The fragility of the moment required careful decisions that would ensure the continuity of the dynasty and strengthen the empire. Solomon, therefore, would not only inherit the kingdom, but also the responsibility of restoring trust and unity among the people of Israel, who still felt the effects of betrayal and violence. The path to the crown would be a challenge, not only politically but morally. David, already aging and marked by his own choices and failures, now had to place the kingdom's stability in his son's hands. The succession to the throne of Israel would not merely be a transfer of power, but a crucial moment in defining the future of the nation. These delicate and complex succession dynamics would become part of the great story of Israel and mark the beginning of a new chapter in the life of King Solomon, who over time would be remembered as one of the greatest kings Israel ever had. The tragic end of Absalom and Solomon's turbulent succession offer a profound reflection on the complexities of leadership and justice. What began as a prosperous and united kingdom under David transformed, over generations, into a scenario of division and betrayal. And it is in this story that we can extract valuable lessons, both for rulers and societies. First, David's example reveals the importance of balancing power and compassion. David, at many points in his life, demonstrated himself to be an admirable leader, but his failures as a father and his imprecise choices, such as failing to administer justice in relation to Amnon, showed that leadership should not only be about strength or authority. The king of Israel, despite being described as a man after God's own heart, was also human, and his personal failures shaped the destiny of his family and consequently his kingdom. In the case of Absalom, the lessons about unchecked ambition are clear. Absalom was a charming prince, admired for his beauty and charisma, but his vanity and thirst for power blinded him to the consequences of his actions. He believed he could replace his father on the throne, but his betrayal and the murder of his own brother were a reflection of his inability to deal with the suffering and pain of his family. His lack of forgiveness and desire for revenge led him to self-destruction. His death, hanging from a tree by his own hair, symbolized, in a cruel way, the irony of his journey. It was his own vanity that handed him over to his fate. Solomon, the son who would come to rule Israel after Absalom's death, represents the importance of wisdom as the foundation for just leadership. Though young, Solomon was able to balance the tensions of his time, learn from past mistakes, and act in a way that ensured the stability of the kingdom. His wisdom, especially in judging people and resolving conflicts, became a hallmark of his leadership. However, he too would face challenges. Justice is not just about deciding what is right, but about being able to listen, understand, and act in a way that promotes peace and the well-being of the people. Solomon's decision in the case of the two women who claimed to be the mother of a child, for example, illustrates not only his wisdom, but also how he viewed justice as something beyond written law, something that touched the hearts of people. The cycle of betrayal, revenge, and reconciliation that runs through this story also highlights the fragility of human relationships and the need for forgiveness. Both David and Absalom failed to address the deeper feelings that motivated them. King David, by failing to punish Amnon for his crime, and Absalom, by seeking revenge instead of reconciliation. When Absalom dies, David expresses immeasurable grief. His immortal words, "O Absalom, my son, would I had died in your place," reveal the tragedy of a father who, after all the battles and victories, was unable to prevent the destruction of his own family. The lessons about leadership and justice also teach us that ruling is an act of responsibility, not just toward the throne, but primarily toward the people the king governs. The story of David, Absalom, and Solomon shows us that true leadership is not about gaining power at any cost, but about protecting and serving the well-being of all. True justice, as we've seen, is more than just the enforcement of laws. It requires wisdom, empathy, and above all, courage to do what is right, even when it requires personal sacrifice. David's dynasty, marked by ups and downs, reminds us that the fate of a kingdom is closely tied to the choices made by its rulers. The true strength of a leader lies in his ability to learn from mistakes, correct the course when necessary, and above all, be just and compassionate with those he leads. Thus, the lessons drawn from this narrative are not confined to the past, but continue to resonate in the challenges of leadership and justice at any time. What we learn from David, Absalom, and Solomon is that power and ambition can corrupt, but wisdom, justice, and forgiveness can restore and transform. As the story of David, Absalom, and Solomon comes to an end, we are led to reflect on the complexity of human relationships and the weight of the choices we make. The cycle of tragedy and redemption that runs through this biblical narrative offers us more than lessons about power, leadership, and family. It challenges us to look inward at ourselves and the society we live in. First, the story of Absalom reminds us of the danger of letting unchecked ambition dominate our lives. The relentless pursuit of power and recognition, without due consideration for the consequences, can destroy not only our personal relationships, but also jeopardize the well-being of those around us. Absalom, with his beauty, charisma, and leadership skills, could have been a force for good, but his inability to forgive, his excessive pride, and his thirst for vengeance led him to ruin. His fate shows us how, at times, our own internal weaknesses can be more destructive than any external enemy. David's figure, on the other hand, offers a reflection on human nature and the difficulties everyone faces when trying to balance leadership with personal life. Though he was a great king, with notable victories, David was also marked by grave flaws, both as a father and as a leader. His failure to act in the face of Amnon's crime and his troubled relationship with Absalom show how omission can be just as harmful as wrong action. At the same time, the grief he expresses over Absalom's death reveals a deeply human side, the unconditional love of a father, even in the face of all the betrayal. Then there is Solomon, the son who succeeded David on the throne. The wisdom he demonstrated in his judgments and in the way he sought to restore order in Israel after Absalom's death is an example of how wisdom, when applied with integrity and justice, can be a powerful force for healing and unity. However, Solomon's story also teaches us that, no matter how wise someone may be, it is impossible to escape the challenges and complications that arise over a lifetime. Solomon's wisdom, though essential, was not enough to avoid the conflicts that arose within his own lineage. But perhaps the most important lesson emerges from the final tragedy: the importance of following the path of justice, compassion, and forgiveness. While David deeply mourns Absalom's death, we recognize that in many moments, the choices we make, whether through action or omission, have consequences far beyond our immediate understanding. Repentance and forgiveness are necessary for healing, but they are also processes that require courage and humility. So, what legacy does this story leave us? Perhaps it is the call to be more conscious of our choices, to seek wisdom and justice, and to understand that the true power of a leader lies not only in conquering, but in serving with integrity. The story of David and his sons, with all its pain and moments of glory, invites us to reflect on how we can improve our own leadership, our own way of handling adversity, and our relationships with those we love. Now, as we conclude this journey through the story of David and his sons, we invite you, the viewer, to reflect on the lessons this narrative leaves behind. How can the lessons of leadership, justice, and forgiveness be applied in your own life? What have you learned about the importance of wisdom and compassion in the decisions you make? Share your reflections in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you in any way, subscribe for more content exploring the timeless lessons of history and human wisdom. The path of truth and justice is complex, but together we can learn and grow, just like the figures who shaped the destiny of Israel. And remember, even in the greatest tragedies, there is always something to learn and something to teach.